Today I'll say something about the relationship between normalcy or normality, psychologically speaking and philosophically speaking, mental wellness, mental health, normality on the one hand, and socialization on the other hand. How is normality related to socialization, and how does normality relate to freedom? These are interesting questions because in order to be normality is a normative concept. If I am normal, then I could also be abnormal. Only the possibility of choosing to be abnormal allows me to freely be normal, to choose to be normal. And to choose to be normal largely means to accept certain values, to accept certain norms, and typically these are the norms shared by my society. So the concepts of normality or normalcy are different in different societies. Someone who is considered psychotic, schizophrenic, for example, in one society might be considered exceptionally gifted, special in a different society. They might be considered particularly valuable members of that society, whereas in the Western society someone who is schizophrenic is typically treated as a client of the mental health system. So, to be normal, I need to accept certain norms. Normality is a highly normative concept. But in order for me to accept norms, I must presuppose a degree of freedom to choose to either accept or not accept the norms. If I don't have a choice but to accept certain norms, then that has no value, no moral value, no normative value. This is something I am forced to do, so this is not my choice, and it would only be possible to describe me as normal by a very large extension. Forcing someone to behave in a way which we define as normal rules out our ability to consider that person fully normal, because in order to be fully normal, that person would have to voluntarily choose to behave in a way which we see as normal, right? If someone wishes to behave in an antisocial way, or they wish to constantly deviate from social norms in whatever manner, but they are forced by their family, by their social group, by their institutions to constantly abide by social norms, this is not the full sense of normality, normalcy. You can force a psychiatric patient in a psychiatric ward to behave in certain ways by a combination of drugs and behavioral therapy and coercion. Often coercion is used in psychiatric wards in various ways. Compliance is demanded of patients to the wishes and instructions issued by the mental health system staff. And this is not normalcy, because the normal, conditionally normal, behavior is extracted from people. It's not their voluntary choice. So where's the space for freedom in our concept of normalcy? On the one hand, we can only choose what we are offered. We can only choose the options of norms and values which our society offers us. It's very difficult for us to accept systems of beliefs and systems of values which simply don't exist in our environment, which we would have to learn about from who knows what sources and become familiar with the way of life in line with those values and norms in who knows what ways. So on the one hand, our choice is limited, and on the other hand, there must be a choice. There must be a principled possibility for us to make this or that choice. One choice or another choice. The choice of normalcy or the choice of abnormality. Now, if there is a choice to be normal or to be abnormal, then there's a degree of intentionality in mental illness. Then mental illness is not really an illness like other medical conditions. It is what the psychoanalysts believed was a particular choice. Mental illness can be interpreted as a choice based on our freedom, a choice of abnormality, a choice which arises from a variety of reasons and is fueled by a variety of motivations, most likely by the motivation to compensate for the unbearable experience of encountering what Jacques Lacan called the crude reality of life. Lacan believed that the real, with a capital R, the register of the real, of the raw, unprocessed content of our daily experiences, of our life experience, is so unbearable to the human psyche that it necessarily leads to psychosis. So the only way to regain mental wellness in the face of unbearable of the stress of encountering the unbearable real is to symbolically process that raw experience and give it meaning. According to Lacan, the raw experience, the raw contact with the world is devoid of meaning, and our symbolic register, what he calls the symbolic with the capital S, is the capacity to endow the raw experience with meanings that allow us to psychologically metabolize the raw experience, and thus for Lacan, mental wellness and mental health and normalcy reside in the realm of the symbolic, not in the realm of the real. When our symbolic abilities are not sufficient to process what Lacan called the onslaught of the unbearable real, we choose the third register. This is the register of the imaginary. So the register of the real is the first one, the register of the symbolic is the second one, the healthy one, and the register of the imaginary is the third one. This is the register of psychosis. We venture into the imaginary, we swap the real with the imaginary, we deliberately lose contact with the real. In the symbolic register we have a very clear, very consistent, very constant contact with the real, and we have that real under control by processing it through our symbolic categories. But when we don't have sufficient symbolic resources, we simply abandon the real and choose the imaginary. This is the psychosis. Now, the psychosis is therefore a compensation for our absence in the real and for the absence of the real in our life. But the real reason the real can't be absorbed into our life is the lack in our symbolic capacities. The symbolic capacities are structured by what Lacan calls the signifiers. Signifiers, these are the orienters, the lights by which we navigate our life. And the primary signifier for Lacan is called the name of the Father. Name of the Father. This is the signifier which is traditionally associated with the male role, the role of the father in a child's life. And that is the signifier that relates to what I started with, and that is socialization, norms, structure, relationships, the acceptance of certain values, of certain belief systems, which constitute normalcy in a particular normative order, in a particular society. And this is associated with accepting the authority of the traditional role of the father in the bourgeois French family of Lacan's time. That was the role of the legislator, the norm setter, and the socializer of the family, whereas the role of the mother was the role of the unconditional caregiver and supporter of the young child. The symbolic register is structured internally by the signifiers, the top one of which is name of the Father, and the deficiencies in the symbolic register which cause psychosis, which again is an exercise. The choice for a psychosis is again an exercise of freedom. So the capacities of the lack of the capacities of the symbolic, which cause us to choose psychosis are associated primarily with the blockage or complete removal of the primary signifier name of the Father. So this is the internal structure of the symbolic register in our psyche. So according to Lacanian psychoanalysis, freedom exists as a logical assumption and as a practical, at the same time as a practical necessity in choosing normalcy or abnormality, where the abnormality has various phases. One is psychosis, as I said, which is a compensation, and a person with psychosis continues to be partly functional, but partly dysfunctional at the same time. And the second major phase of abnormality is the so-called catastrophic outcome in psychoanalysis, and that is catatonia, that is a complete loss, disorganization of the person, disorganization of the personality, and the person's inability to control their body, to exercise any kind of coherent action. Contrary to popular belief in psychiatry that the only catastrophic outcome in the psych professions is suicide. Suicide is not the catastrophic outcome according to Lacanian psychoanalysis. Suicide requires the person to be fairly organized. In order to commit a suicide, one must have sufficient coherence in one's personality to conceptualize, plan, and execute a suicide. This person who commits a suicide is still very much together, very much able to act. Whereas structurally speaking, the catastrophic outcome is catatonia, where the person is no longer able to decide anything or able to act. The person is so disorganized as a structure that the person that no longer exists. They can't make any decision. So the other extreme to that catastrophic outcome, catatonia, is the ideal of a perfectly healthy personality, coherent, resilient, able to tolerate stress, mature, whatever criteria we use to assess the health of a personality. They are relative, because there's no ideally healthy personality. There are only various degrees of coherence in one's personality organization. And according to Lacan, the exercise of freedom to be extremely healthy, very healthy, to exist somewhere towards the top of that hierarchy of mental health, is associated with one's symbolic capacity. So a person who is better educated, who is more articulate, who is more philosophical, who has more understanding of abstract concepts, will likely be more able to withstand various onslaughts of the unbearable real, and will have greater symbolic capacities and greater resilience to psychosis. Whereas a person who can only poorly conceptualize life and whose experience of the immediate reality is fairly simple will be more susceptible to deciding to venture into the imaginary. So, where we are on this spectrum of mental health, and the way we exercise our freedom to be more or less healthy or more or less mentally unwell, depends on the strength of the two registers. The register of the symbolic primarily, and within it the degree of preservation and strength and functionality of the primary signifier name of the Father, the fatherly structure in our psyche, the patriarchal structure of the normalcy of our psyche on the one hand, or the strength of the temptation associated with the imaginary, which is an escape route in the face of complete destruction of the personality when confronted by the unbearably real.